For the past 1.5 years, off and on, we've been working our way through the main types of literature that are found in our biblical library. You've heard me say over and over again, the Bible is not a book, it is a library, and in that library are many different kinds of books. And there are really only two literary genres, main ones, left that we haven't explored. Apocalypse, the kind of literature we find in the book of Revelation, and what I'll call the worldview stories of early Genesis. So, Revelation, I'm going to postpone for a while because I'm really hoping the rapture will come before I have to deal with it. But if that doesn't happen, I really have a special guest I have in mind that I'd like to come, and maybe he and I can converse up here. Think of it as a live podcast. That's what I have in mind. So this morning then we'll start work on the other, and that's early Genesis. This is going to be a fairly significant and detailed series on early Genesis, and in part that's because big if, I have a biblical specialty, it's early Genesis. For years I've taught classes and preached and given lectures and written about it. I don't usually talk about having a PhD because the only time I'm called Dr. Teel is at home, and that's usually a warning that I'm about to be mocked. But outside the home, where people astonishingly do say occasionally Dr. Teel with a straight face, a large part of my Dr. Teel work has involved thinking about Christianity and science and philosophy and, among other things, early Genesis. So, I'm warning you, buckle up. And just so I'm clear, by early Genesis, I mean the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the part of Genesis that comes before the story of Abraham begins. And I want you to remember that it's with Abraham that the story of the Israelite nation begins. And so the 11 chapters before Abraham, we could call the pregame show for the Israelite story. And what do we find in those 11 chapters? Well, we find all sorts of things you'll remember from picture books and Sunday school. We find the creation story, which is a lie, because there are two creation stories, but they often get melded into one. We find the Eden stories, with Adam and Eve in the garden. The story we unfortunately call the fall, but which Genesis does not. We find the Cain and Abel story. We find the flood story, featuring Noah, who has only one speaking line. And it only occurs well after the flood is over. That's the only time Noah talks. Look it up. It's not a good speech. We have the so-called Tower of Babel story, and I will make the case later that that story is misnamed by the extra heading that our Bible publishers so helpfully inserted into the text. It is actually not primarily a story about the tower. And of course we have lots and lots of genealogies, some of them with shockingly huge lifespans. Again, these are things you've heard about. In fact, I'm not sure if there is another part of the Bible with which we are both so familiar and so uninformed. And that familiarity and ignorance combined to create a fraught relationship with early Genesis. At least for many of us, it is fraught. Because if you, like I did, grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical setting, and there are a fair number of evangelical refugees among us, then I can probably tell you the story of your relationship with early Genesis. Here it is. You started well. You were immersed in the stories through picture books and Sunday school and coloring books and all sorts of things. But around the age of youth group, the feeling around early Genesis started to change, and actually changed quite dramatically, and as if there weren't already enough dramatic changes for you at the youth group time of your life. Early Genesis, you eventually learned, either directly or indirectly, early Genesis is the location of a proxy war being fought between the forces of good, that's people like you and your youth pastor, and the forces of evil, demons, liberal Christians, scientists. We'll talk more about that later. But the point is you learned that there isn't room to interpret the beautiful poetic literature of early Genesis in a variety of ways. No, there's only one way to read early Genesis, and that is to read it as if it were a science report. Don't lose sight of that, you were told, because there's a lot on the line. In fact, everything is on the line. It's a bit like that Dutch boy keeping his finger in the dike to protect his village. One slip up on early Genesis and atheism will come flooding in. Now, all sorts of things flow from that fraught, tension-filled understanding. And I'm going to take, this is the grumping part, I'm going to take a lot of time this morning to share examples of what happens when we think this way. And I'm sure you could add a lot more things to this list. I'm just going to give you examples from my life. And it might feel a little like overkill, but I believe it's really important to name and describe the tensions and the struggles and the hurt and the just plain silliness that is caused by what I believe is a narrow and impoverished and mistaken way of reading early Genesis. So here are some examples of the kinds of things that happen when we read early Genesis badly. So let me start with this first example from my life. I'm starting with a quotation. Did fish really climb onto the land? Did humans really come from monkeys? Is evolution really a scientific theory, or is it merely a wishful hypothesis, mainly unsupported by the facts? Unquote. Thus begins a paper I wrote in grade 12. My mother kindly saved that paper and mailed it to me. A paper in which I argued vigorously and, of course, persuasively against the theory of evolution. Because of that proxy war going on in early Genesis, I knew that evolution was a threat to the Christian faith, and I was fighting the good fight. Also, this was a public school, so I was being a good witness. Here's another example from decades later. As some of you know, Heidi and I homeschooled our 3 daughters, and when they were younger, we were more connected with the Christian homeschooling community, where there are a lot of people whose primary motivation for homeschooling has to do with the way they read early Genesis. Here are 2 interactions from that time. In the first, on a field trip to, I believe, the salmon run in Goldstream, as the guide was giving a talk, a homeschooling mother, clearly very upset, very concerned, leaned over to Heidi and whispered, "Did he just say the E word?" Heidi struggled to determine what the E word was. She was going through her list of rude things you can say. So Heidi asked, and with reluctance, the woman said, "Evolution." During another time, in our dining room, having our once-a-year meeting with a representative of a local Christian homeschooling organization, we informed her that we would, and we were polite about this, I really believe that, we informed her that we would not be using their recommended so-called Christian biology textbook, a textbook that actively denied a lot of science. We told her why. Again, I think respectfully, we told her we thought evolution was the current best explanation for the development of life on this planet, that we saw evolution as a gift, and that we believed The giver of that gift was God. She was silent for a bit, and then she told us that it was fine, that evolution is not a, and these are her words in our dining room, evolution is not a turn or burn issue. So it was okay, barely, that we were exposing our children to, quote, pro-evolutionary propaganda, unquote, by which she meant the museum. I once gave a talk on early Genesis and evolution and Christianity at an evening lecture series hosted by an evangelical church here in town. It really was trying to get things right, to stay open to new possibilities, to talk about issues evangelical churches usually avoided. So it was an honorable exercise. And at the end, a very tall man with a very wrecked voice came up to me and really wanted to talk. He looked to be about 70. I learned later he had just recently retired as a government scientist. His job had been to lead teams monitoring the evolution of crop pathogens to help farmers take steps to fight them off. He had helped save the Canadian wheat harvest on numerous occasions. He said to me, from on high, "All my life, I have felt like two people. In church, I've heard people talk about the myth of evolution, and I've said nothing. I've even nodded along. But at work, I watch evolution happen. I've seen it for myself. I would have been unemployed without evolution. Tonight, you've put me back together as a whole person, and I need to give you a hug." I know another scientist, a man right now at a BC university, who's regarded as one of the world's leading researchers on evolution and genetics. He was involved in the Human Genome Project. He's currently one of the leaders of what you might call the Salmon Genome Project. Among other things, they're trying to get a handle on what's happening genetically when we have Atlantic salmon in fish farms in the Pacific Ocean. He teaches a very high-level course on molecular evolution, what's happening at the molecular level. He's been published in the journal Nature. He's no slouch, is what I'm trying to say. And he's a Christian, attending a fairly moderate evangelical church. And what has he learned growing up in church as a budding biologist and then later as a widely praised biologist? He has learned to keep his head down, to avoid talking about his work. He told me his non-religious, and some of them even anti-religious, fellow scientists are way more open to how his science and his faith work together than his church colleagues are. He's surprised and saddened by how interested the scientists are in bringing together science and faith, and how uninterested his fellow Christians are. So those are two examples from the professional scientist perspective, but on the other side, of course, as you know, are fundamentalist Christians who read early Genesis like a science report, and as a result, they see conflict between what Genesis says and what modern scientists say. More than conflict, actually. They see a spiritual battle. And that's how they frame their struggle with mainstream science. Why, these fundamentalists ask, why is the entire scientific enterprise against them? Now, there's one quick answer to that. Because reality itself may be against them. But we'll set that aside for a moment. They wonder, why is the entire scientific enterprise against them? And here's how they feel. It's not just against them, it's against their way of reading Genesis. But their way of reading Genesis is the way of reading Genesis. So science is against Genesis itself. That's how they perceive it. Therefore, science is against the Bible and against God. They see, and again, the question is why? And here's their answer. What's really happening is a spiritual battle, a battle between two opposite worldviews, the biblical worldview and the scientific worldview. And since it's a battle of worldviews, they say, the evidence doesn't really matter. Either way, each side just interprets the evidence as they see fit. And I want to give you an example of what I mean by that. That was a lot of words. Let me give you an example. Some years back, I sat through a workshop led by a science teacher who worked at a small, extremely conservative Christian school, not anywhere around here. He was obviously a young earth creationist, and he presented creation science, as it's sometimes called, which is an alternative to evolution and geology and astronomy. An alternative that makes sense of what there is and ties it into a 6,000-year-old cosmos. Now, I was there for research purposes, because I'm interested in these debates. At the end, he invited questions, and so I raised my hand and I said, politely, I just want to make sure I understand one of your main points. Are you saying that the controversy over evolution is, at its core, a conflict of worldviews, and that the physical evidence doesn't really matter and shouldn't really point us one way or the other? Yes, he said, that's exactly my point. And is this a struggle between the biblical worldview and the scientific worldview? I asked. Yes, he said. Then I would like to hear, I asked, what you think about the discovery in the 1600s that the Earth actually travels around the sun rather than vice versa. Most people, I said, Christians included, understand that as a step forward in our understanding of the world. In your view, was that progress, or was that a loss for the biblical worldview, since many people at that time were arguing that the Bible says the earth doesn't move? Now, I fully expected him to say something like, oh, no, that's a totally different question. Everyone knows the earth goes around the sun. So I had a follow-up question ready, and that's what I was really interested in. The follow-up question was, why and how was that struggle then different from the current struggle some Christians have about evolution? I wanted him to identify what he thought the difference was, but we never got there. Because I was stunned to hear him say to a crowded room, no, in the 1600s that was not progress. That was a triumph of the scientific worldview at the expense of the biblical worldview. And it has led us to where we are today. So there I was in the 21st century, listening to a professional educator apparently deny the reality of the heliocentric solar system. Shouldn't even use the word solar system. All because of an insistence on reading early Genesis in one particular way. Now, between the Christian scientists I've described and the Christian anti-scientists I've described, are there poor pastors? Because all those people go to church. About 15 years ago, Regent College ran a 3-year program designed especially to help pastors and other church leaders, to help them equip their congregations with a theological and positive understanding of science. I was lucky to be on the faculty of that program, so it was my privilege to talk to all sorts of people on all sorts of front lines. In one session, several pastors told me something like, what really concerns us is spiritual growth, not mathematical growth. And for our congregations to grow spiritually, we feel we need to discuss evolution with them in a healthy and non-hostile way. But we know there are some who really won't want that. And we're under such pressure to grow the congregation numerically. So based on my own experience as a pastor in an evangelical setting, I had to tell them the truth as I saw it. So I said, if you speak about different ways of approaching early Genesis, and if you treat evolution as something that might actually be part of God's good creation, know for sure that some people will leave your church. But they'll find a place, I said to them. They'll always find a place. But if you don't speak about evolution, know for sure that some people will leave the church. Not your church, but the church. Because they'll come to see Christianity as something like a cult that refuses to interact with reality. And that isn't just some hypothetical situation, as I'm sure you know. There are many of us here who know people who were set up by their churches or parents or youth pastors with what is objectively and demonstrably a false choice: science or the Bible. And when those young people grew up, and when they went to university, and when they saw the strength of the scientific evidence for themselves, well, they simply did what they were set up to do. They chose, and they left the church. And again, all of this angst over how to read early Genesis. It's important to get it right. But how did we get here? What starts well, being immersed as a child in the stories of early Genesis, so often ends badly. Here's what may be an obvious statement. Reading like a child should be followed by reading like an adult. Children should just soak in the stories. Just let children be children. But adults approaching any kind of literature need to start thinking about things like context and literature type and original audience and things like that. But somehow, with early Genesis, just when we're ready to start understanding the ancient Near Eastern literature that is early Genesis, we get dragged down into this culture war. And we're told we must read ancient Genesis as if it were modern science. And it just doesn't work. Any of a whole variety of things might catch your attention as you try to read early Genesis as a work of modern scientific description. You might notice, for example, that before God does any creating, there is already water. What's that about? Speaking of water, you might notice that God creates a vault, a firmament that separates the ocean we have on earth from another ocean up in the sky, above the vault. Read Genesis 1 this week. It's in there. You might notice all sorts of inconsistencies between the creation story in Genesis 1 and the different creation story in Genesis 2. Are the man and the woman created separately or at the same time? Yes. Is vegetation created before the man or after? Yes. How about the animals, before or after? Yes. Are the heavens and the earth created in 6 days or in 1 day? Yes. You might also notice that there is a talking snake. A talking snake who apparently used to walk, since the punishment is crawling and eating dust. At which point, you might notice there's a snake eating dust. You might start to ask questions about the flood and the ark. Was the flood freshwater or saltwater? Whichever it was, how did the other kind of fish survive? Since the total flood time was about a year, it's a long time to hold your breath. Could a pair of every single kind of animal on earth really fit in one boat along with enough food for a year? Even if the answer is yes, how did the kangaroos get to the ark? And how did they get back? I once had a conversation in the office of a well-known Old Testament scholar with over a dozen books to his name. I won't name him because I haven't asked his permission to pass this along, because I don't want to ask his permission. We were in his office, and because I was about to start teaching a course on early Genesis, he warned me about what he believed would be my biggest challenge. He said, "Nobody reads early Genesis strictly literally. Nobody does. You can't. But the problem is that there are so many people who think they do. And when you point that they don't really, and you point that out, no matter how gentle you try to be, they tend to get very angry. They're angry because they're afraid. And they're afraid because they've been told that their faith will fall apart if they don't read early Genesis strictly, literally. And he was right, I have found that a little. But at the other end of the spectrum, I've also found that progressive or liberal Christians widely acknowledge that you can't read early Genesis literally. They're proud that they don't. But in my experience, even these liberal Christians still think early Genesis was meant to be read literally. That it was written by ancient, superstitious people who were ignorant about how the world really is. So they just kind of write it off. So we have this weird situation where those Christians we call conservative and those we call liberal agree on something. They both say that if you read early Genesis literally, you can't accept modern science. But the ones we call conservative reject modern science to defend the scriptures, and the Christians we call liberal reject early Genesis to defend modern science. What's to be done about this? Is there a middle way? A middle way that avoids the false choice between science and early Genesis? Is there a middle way that can affirm with the conservatives that the Bible is important and shouldn't be ignored, but can also affirm with the liberals that the text is rooted in the ancient Near East? Is there a way to affirm the importance and the truth of both early Genesis and modern science? And wouldn't it be really discouraging if I said, no, there's no way. So, good night. Of course, my answer is yes. As I've quoted many times already here at this pulpit, and I'm sorry for the repetition, but I love this saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get exegetical. And the going is tough in early Genesis, as I'm trying to demonstrate. And I believe exegesis is the key. Exegesis, fancy word that means the work we do to get our heads around original context and literary genre and original audience and initial intent, things like that. And I believe that opens up a beautiful way forward because, as it turns out, early Genesis, when it is understood in its original ancient Near Eastern context, has some amazingly beautiful and shocking and progressive and world-changing things to say about God and about the world and about what it means to be human. Our job is to listen to early Genesis and try to understand its agenda. Our job is not to shout at each other about early Genesis because of our own little agendas. Most of this sermon, as I warned you, has been about that shouting at each other that we do. The silliness and the suffering and the angst that comes from reading early Genesis badly. And again, I think it's important to be honest about that. But careful exegesis can change all of that. So I want to end with a brief glimpse of what's to come in this series. And actually, the things you've already heard in terms of the call to worship and the scripture and the songs have already really gotten a good sense. You've gotten a good sense of this. Here's a brief glimpse. Here's a teaser of the good news that is coming in this series. Against the backdrop of the normal ancient Near Eastern worldview, and that's going to be a lot of the work that I have to do, is get you to think like an ancient Near Eastern person so that you can then be shocked by early Genesis. Against the normal understanding, early Genesis proclaims what was at that time a radically new way of understanding God, humanity, and the world. Early Genesis taught the Israelites, and through them the whole world, that God is an artist filled with delight. God is a loving provider. God is gracious and loyal and forgiving. The world is good and can be counted on to stay that way. There is no chaos monster lurking over the horizon, threatening to defeat God and destroy the world. We can rest. Humans are not slaves, but instead are radically equal, image-bearing, truly free creatures whose freedom is designed to lead to the flourishing of all humans and all creation. Morality is grounded not in the God's unchanging whims, but morality is grounded in the eternally good character of God, whose expectations are known and unchanging, so we can rest in that too. So that's a little taste of what's coming in the Gospel of Genesis. This is what we'll unearth through the practice of exegesis, and it amounts to basically the foundation of the story. The story, the biblical story in which all of our smaller stories find meaning and purpose and dignity. So stay tuned.